Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corn. So you guys might know that I'm one of those weird tech people that kind of fit between these boxes, which sometimes can make for a sad and lonely existence. But actually with the Reddit and Discord, even if you're just in the weird places between the Venn diagrams, you can find friends. What I mean by that is you guys know that I've been using Linux for 20, 30 years and that I'm a pretty hardcore tech enthusiast, but I'm not a gamer. I don't game. The only game I've really ever gotten into was Flight Simulator. I don't know if you can actually call that a game, but without any disrespect or hurt intended to gamers, it's just not something I want to do. The idea of simulating anything on a computer has just never really appealed to me. So sometimes when I, go on Discord, I come across certain things, I feel very alienated because everyone's talking about stuff through the vantage point of gaming, and I'm interested in the same things, but just for like general use. I guess you could call maybe this podcast is my own version of a game, learning. But anyway, whatever we want to call it. One of the things that gamers have been big into, and that I always see come up in the BIOS, is overclocking, and that's what I'd love to talk about today. So the idea always seems kind of weird to me. You have RAM, let's say, in a computer that's rated up to a certain speed or level of performance. But then you can overclock it. Now, what I find a bit confusing is that you'd think that this sounded like a hack. And usually when the community comes up with something kind of hacky like this, vendors don't really want to be enabling it or supporting it. But when you go into any motherboard from Asus or any of the major manufacturers, you see that overclocking is actually a really normal thing. It's not exactly a hack that you have to dig very hard to find. A couple of pages in the BIOS menu, you're going to see settings for overclocking stuff. I've never done it because my computer is fast enough, and as a non-gamer, I didn't see the point of, trying to speed up the RAM by another little bit. I'm using my home server mostly for storage and my desktop for hardest thing I do with it is video editing. But even then, again, didn't see any benefit. But I'm just curious, Herman and Corn, we talked about it in the context of data centers. If hardware is capable of doing more than what it says in the box, what's the point of being so conservative on the box that people end up hacking around it? And when we talk about overclocking, I guess computers can get expensive, especially those that the people doing the overclocking are building. I always assumed this was an automatic warranty blocker. Like if you overclocked any component, that's it. If it goes wrong, you're on your own. Sorry, you did something weird. Final part of my question. Overclock. I never understood exactly what can be overclocked. I understand RAM can be overclocked. VRAM on a GPU, if I'm not mistaken. The CPU, in practical terms, what are the components that one can and cannot push beyond their limits? And finally, I usually ask you guys a bundle of questions. What is actually happening with overclocking? By which I mean, is the mechanics of overclocking that you deliver a bit more electricity, that you increase the voltage going to the hardware a little bit to drive out that extra performance? I have a few more about how this works with drivers, but I think that's enough to get a good handle on what this actually means in practice. Herman and Corn, let's talk about overclocking computer hardware in today's episode of My Word Prompts.
Herman, I was looking at my workstation the other day, just staring at the task manager, and I realized there is this invisible ceiling we all just kind of accept. We go to the store, or we go online, and we buy a piece of hardware. It says it runs at a certain speed on the box. Maybe it is 3.6 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz, and we just assume that is the absolute hard-coded limit of what it can do. It is like a law of nature. But there is this whole subculture of people, this entire community, who look at those numbers on the box and just see them as a polite suggestion.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, you are talking about the thrill of the overclock. It is a classic tinkerer's mindset. It is the digital equivalent of taking a stock car off the showroom floor and immediately opening the hood to tune the engine, adjust the intake, and see exactly how much horsepower you can squeeze out of it before the whole thing catches fire. Today's prompt comes from Daniel, and it is a deep dive into that exact world. Daniel wants to know why manufacturers are so conservative with their ratings if the hardware can do more. He wants to know why overclocking is a standard feature in the basic input-output system, what we call the BIOS. And he wants to know the actual gritty mechanics of how you push hardware beyond its rated limits.
It is a great topic because it feels like a bit of a paradox. If I buy a processor that is rated for 4 GHz, but it is physically capable of running at 4.5 GHz, why wouldn't the company just sell it as a 4.5 GHz chip? It seems like they are leaving money on the table. If they could charge an extra $50 for that extra speed, they would, right? Is it just about safety, or is there something deeper happening on the factory floor?
Oh, it is much deeper than just safety or caution. It really comes down to a fundamental concept in semiconductor manufacturing called binning. To understand binning, you have to understand that making computer chips is not like making Lego bricks. It is not a perfectly repeatable, identical process every time. Imagine you are baking 100 chocolate chip cookies. Even if you use the exact same dough from the same bowl and put them in the same oven at the same time, some cookies are going to come out perfectly golden and chewy. Some might be a little bit darker on the edges because they were closer to the heating element. Maybe one or two in the corner are slightly underbaked in the middle.
Right, because at the microscopic scale of silicon, even a few stray atoms or a tiny fluctuation in temperature or pressure during the manufacturing process can change the electrical characteristics of the chip.
Exactly. We are talking about features that are measured in nanometers. In 26, we are looking at processes that are pushing the limits of the 2 nanometer and 18 angstrom nodes. At that scale, perfection is impossible. So, when a company like Intel, AMD, or Nvidia manufactures a giant circular wafer of processors, they don't know exactly what they have until they test it. This is the binning process. Once the chips are cut from the wafer, the manufacturers put them through a series of rigorous, automated tests. They see how fast each individual chip can go while remaining perfectly stable at a specific voltage and within a specific thermal envelope.
So they are essentially grading them like eggs. Grade A, Grade B, Grade C.
Precisely. The absolute best chips, the ones that can hit the highest speeds while using the least amount of power, get binned as high-end products. Those become your Core i9s or your Ryzen 9s. The chips that are functional but can't quite hit those peak frequencies without crashing or getting too hot get binned as mid-range or entry-level chips, like an i5 or a Ryzen 5. Sometimes, if a chip has a defect in one of its cores, they will just disable that core and sell it as a lower-tier product with fewer cores. It is all about maximizing the yield from every wafer.
So, when I see a rating on the box, that is essentially the manufacturer's guarantee of stability for the worst performing chip in that specific bin.
That is the key insight. They have to guarantee that every single chip sold under that model name will work perfectly for years, under a wide variety of conditions. That includes someone running the computer in a dusty room in the middle of a summer heat wave with a cheap, tiny cooler and a mediocre power supply. To ensure that level of universal reliability, they leave a significant buffer. In the industry, they call it the guardband. Overclocking is essentially the user reaching into that guardband and reclaiming that extra performance that the manufacturer left there for the sake of safety and mass market stability.
That makes total sense. It is like a speed limit on a highway. The limit might be 65 miles per hour because that is what is safe for a heavy truck in the rain with old tires. But your high-performance sports car on a sunny day with a professional driver can easily handle 90. But then, Herman, why is overclocking such a standard feature in the BIOS? If the manufacturers are so worried about stability and they spend all this money on binning, why do they give us the tools to mess with it so easily? It feels like giving a teenager a Ferrari and then putting a go faster button right on the dashboard.
That is a fascinating bit of industry history and psychological marketing. For a long time, in the 80s and early 90s, overclocking was a dark art. It wasn't a feature, it was a hack. You had to physically bridge connections on the motherboard with conductive pens, or flip tiny physical switches called dip switches, or even replace the quartz crystal oscillator on the board to change the system clock. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, the manufacturers realized something important: the enthusiast market. The people who care about that extra 5 or 10% of performance are the ones who drive the conversation. They are the influencers of the tech world.
So, by making it easy to overclock, they are appealing to the power users who will then recommend their products to everyone else. It is a halo effect for the brand.
Exactly. It became a competitive feature. Motherboard manufacturers like Asus, MSI, and Gigabyte started competing to see who could create the most robust BIOS with the most granular controls. They started adding more power phases and better heatsinks to the motherboard specifically to handle the extra stress of overclocking. It turned into a major selling point. Even the chip makers eventually got on board. They realized they could create a new market segment. Intel started selling specifically unlocked processors, like the K-series, and AMD made almost their entire lineup unlocked. They realized they could charge a premium for the privilege of letting you take the risk. You are paying extra for the unlocked multiplier, which is basically a license to tinker.
Which brings us to the big question Daniel had, and the one everyone has, the warranty. If I go into my BIOS and start cranking up the numbers, and my processor dies 2 weeks later, am I just out of luck? Does it automatically void the warranty the second I change a setting?
This is where it gets a bit murky, and it depends on who you ask and where you live. Historically, the answer was a resounding yes. If you overclocked it and it broke, you were on your own. Most BIOS screens actually have a scary warning message that pops up the first time you enter the overclocking menu, saying that you assume all risk and that the manufacturer is not responsible for any damage. However, in practice, it is often very hard for a manufacturer to prove that a chip failed specifically because of a moderate overclock, unless you literally melted the silicon with excessive voltage or left physical burn marks on the socket.
I imagine modern chips have some kind of telemetry or onboard logging, though. We are in 26. Surely they can tell if the chip was running at 1,000 degrees or if it was being fed 2 volts.
They are getting much better at it. Some modern motherboards and processors have what they call fuse bits, or internal non-volatile logs that can record if certain voltage thresholds were exceeded. But here is the interesting shift. Many companies have moved from a forbidden stance to a managed risk stance. For a while, Intel had something called the Performance Protection Plan, where you could pay an extra $20 or $30 for a tuning plan that would give you a one-time replacement if you fried your chip while overclocking. They have moved away from that specific plan recently because the hardware has become so much more robust.
It feels like they have realized that if they build enough safety features into the silicon, most people won't actually be able to break it.
That is a great point. Back in the day, if your cooling fan stopped, your CPU would just keep getting hotter and hotter until it literally smoked and died. Today, the chip is constantly talking to the motherboard. It will detect the heat and immediately throttle itself, slowing down the clock speed to reduce heat. If that doesn't work, it will just trigger an emergency shutdown. So while you can still technically void your warranty, you have to be pretty aggressive, or you have to manually bypass a lot of safety settings in the BIOS to actually cause immediate physical damage. In the United States, we also have the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, which generally says a manufacturer can't deny a warranty claim unless they can prove the modification actually caused the failure. But good luck fighting a multi-billion-dollar corporation in court over a $400 processor.
Let's get into the actual mechanics of it, because Daniel asked if it is just about increasing the voltage. When we talk about making a component go faster, what is actually happening under the hood? What are we actually changing?
It is a delicate dance between 3 main factors: frequency, voltage, and heat. Think of the frequency, the gigahertz, as the tempo of a song. It is how many cycles the processor completes every second. Inside the chip, there are billions of tiny transistors acting like switches. Every time the clock ticks, those switches flip. To make the processor go faster, you increase that tempo. You tell the switches to flip more times per second.
But as they flip faster, they need more energy to make sure the switch actually happens, right?
Exactly. That is where the voltage comes in. Think of voltage as electrical pressure. As the transistors switch on and off faster, the electrical signals have less time to travel and settle. If the voltage isn't high enough, a signal might not reach its destination in time for the next clock cycle. When that happens, you get a bit flip. A 1 becomes a 0, or a 0 becomes a 1. The math doesn't add up anymore, and the system crashes. That is what causes the infamous blue screen of death or a total system hang.
So, the voltage is like the energy that pushes the signal through the resistance of the chip. If you increase the speed, you have to nudge the voltage up to maintain that signal integrity. But there is a massive trade-off, and that is the heat.
And it isn't a linear relationship, it is often exponential. This is due to something called Joule heating. The power consumption of a chip is roughly proportional to the frequency times the square of the voltage. So, if you double the voltage, you are quadrupling the heat output. This is why cooling is the absolute most important part of overclocking. You aren't really limited by the silicon as much as you are limited by your ability to get the heat away from the silicon.
I've seen those videos of extreme overclockers where they use liquid nitrogen. They're pouring it into these copper pots sitting on top of the CPU, and there is clouds of vapor everywhere. It looks like a high-stakes chemistry experiment.
Those guys are the Formula One drivers of the tech world. They are trying to hit 8 or 9 gigahertz for a few seconds just to get a world record. At those temperatures, around minus 196 degrees Celsius, the electrical resistance of the silicon drops, and they can pump massive amounts of voltage through the chip without it melting. But for the average person at home, we are usually talking about high-end air coolers or all-in-one liquid coolers.
Daniel also asked which components can actually be pushed. We usually talk about the CPU, the central processing unit, but what else is on the table?
Almost everything in the high-performance data path can be overclocked. The graphics processing unit, or GPU, is probably the most common one after the CPU. In fact, GPU overclocking is often easier because you can do it right from your desktop using software like MSI Afterburner or the manufacturer's own tools. You can push the core clock of the GPU for better frame rates, and you can also overclock the video memory, the VRAM. Overclocking VRAM can be huge for high-resolution gaming because it increases the bandwidth, the speed at which data moves between the GPU and its memory.
And then there's the system RAM. I remember you telling me about XMP profiles a while back. Is that technically overclocking?
It absolutely is, and it is the most common form of overclocking in the world. XMP stands for Extreme Memory Profile. AMD calls their version EXPO. When you buy a kit of DDR5 RAM that says it is 6000 MHz, that is actually a lie. The official industry standard speed for that RAM might only be 4800 MHz. The 6000 MHz rating is an overclocked profile that the manufacturer tested and saved onto a tiny chip on the RAM stick. When you go into your BIOS and enable XMP, you are technically overclocking your memory and the memory controller inside your CPU.
That is wild. So, millions of people who think they are running stock settings are actually overclocking their memory just by clicking one button in the BIOS. What about things that aren't processors? I have heard of people overclocking their monitors.
You can. It is less common now because modern monitors are so good, but you can sometimes take a monitor that is rated for 60 Hz, meaning it refreshes 60 times a second, and overclock the controller to run at 75 Hz. It is the same principle, finding the hidden headroom. People have even tried overclocking SSDs to get faster read and write speeds, though the gains there are usually tiny and the risk of data corruption is massive. I wouldn't recommend that one to Daniel.
We have talked about the benefits and the mechanics, but I want to go deeper on the long-term risks. Beyond just the immediate crash or the blue screen, is there a hidden cost to running hardware at higher voltages and temperatures over a long period? I'm thinking about that term you used once, electromigration.
You hit the nail on the head. Electromigration is the silent killer of electronics. It is a physical process where the actual atoms of the metal interconnects inside the chip start to move. Imagine a very powerful river wearing away its banks over time. When you push a high current density through those microscopic wires, the electrons literally bump into the metal atoms and slowly push them out of place. Over months or years, this can create voids where the wire gets too thin and breaks, or hillocks, where the metal piles up and creates a short circuit.
So, a chip that was perfectly stable at an overclock for 2 years might suddenly start crashing one day because it is physically degraded at the atomic level.
Exactly. This is why extreme overclocking is a burn-fast, die-young lifestyle for hardware. Now, for most people, this doesn't matter much because they will upgrade their computer in 4 or 5 years anyway. A chip that might have lasted 20 years at stock settings might only last 10 years when overclocked. Since most people don't keep a PC for 10 years, the degradation is invisible to them. But if you are pushing extreme voltages, what we call suicide runs, you could see degradation in a matter of weeks.
It strikes me that the landscape of overclocking has changed a lot recently. Here in 26, it feels like the manufacturers have gotten much better at squeezing every last drop of performance out of the silicon right out of the box. Does that mean the golden age of overclocking is over?
In a way, yes. We have entered the era of opportunistic boosting. Modern CPUs and GPUs are incredibly smart. They have hundreds of sensors monitoring temperature, power draw, and workload in real time. If the chip sees that it has some thermal headroom, meaning it is running cool, it will automatically boost its own clock speed as high as it can go. AMD's Precision Boost Overdrive and Intel's Thermal Velocity Boost are basically built-in, automated overclocking systems.
So, the old school manual overclocking, where you sit there for 6 hours changing numbers by 0.01 and running stress tests, is becoming less necessary for the average gamer.
For the average user, it is almost entirely unnecessary now. In many cases, a manual overclock might even perform worse than the factory auto boost. This is because the auto boost can target a single core and push it really high for a short burst, whereas a manual overclock usually sets all cores to the same speed, which is limited by the weakest core on the chip. Manual overclocking has become more of a hobby for enthusiasts, like people who restore old cars, rather than a practical necessity for getting a playable frame rate in a game.
That is an interesting shift. It is like how cars used to require manual chokes and timing adjustments, but now the engine computer handles all of that in real time to give you the best performance for the current conditions. But you mentioned something earlier that I want to circle back to, undervolting. I have heard people say that in 26, undervolting is actually the real pro move.
I am so glad you brought that up. Undervolting is the flip side of the overclocking coin, and for most people it is much more beneficial. Remember that guardband we talked about? Manufacturers often supply a chip with more voltage than it actually needs to stay stable, just to be safe. Undervolting is the process of finding the lowest possible voltage your specific chip can run at while maintaining its factory speeds.
So, you get the same performance, but the chip uses less power and generates less heat.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Because the chip is running cooler, the auto boost features we just talked about might actually kick in more often and stay active longer. So, by giving the chip less tash power, you can sometimes end up with more performance. It makes the computer quieter because the fans don't have to spin as fast, and it is great for laptops where battery life and heat are the biggest concerns. It is the same level of tinkering as overclocking, but the goal is efficiency and longevity rather than raw brute force speed.
I am curious about the future of this. As we move toward more specialized chips like the AI accelerators and NPUs that are being baked into every processor now, do you think the concept of overclocking will still exist? Or will these chips be so tightly controlled by AI algorithms that there is no room for us to play?
I think there will always be a desire to push the limits. We are already seeing people try to overclock the memory on AI cards to speed up large language model inference. However, we are hitting some very real physical walls. As manufacturing processes get down to the level of individual atoms, we run into things like quantum tunneling, where electrons just start jumping across barriers they aren't supposed to cross because the barriers are too thin. When you hit those physical limits of the universe, no amount of extra voltage is going to help you.
Quantum tunneling is a barrier to my gaming performance. That is about as nerdy as it gets, Herman.
I wear that badge with pride. But it is true. We are reaching the point where the physics of the universe are starting to say no to our desire for more speed. That is why we are seeing more innovation in chip design like 3D stacking, where they pile memory right on top of the processor rather than just trying to make the clock tick faster.
So for Daniel or anyone else listening who is interested in trying this out, maybe they have an older gaming rig, or they just finished a new build and want to see what it can do. What is the first step? aside from making sure they have a good cooler and a high-quality power supply?
The first step is always research. You need to know the specific limits of your hardware. Every generation of chips has a safe voltage limit that the community has discovered through trial and error. Look for forums or databases like overclock.net or the specialized subreddits. Then you need your toolkit. You need software to monitor your temperatures, something like HWinfo, and you need stress testing tools like Cinebench, Prime95, or 3D Mark.
Right, because an overclock that works for 5 minutes of browsing the web might crash the second you try to render a video or load up a demanding game.
Exactly. You want to run a stress test for at least an hour. Some people insist on 24 hours to make sure that those signals are reaching their destinations every single time without error, and the golden rule, always move in small increments. Increase your frequency by maybe 25 or 50 megahertz at a time. Test it. If it is stable, move up again. If it crashes, nudge the voltage up by the smallest possible increment or back off the frequency. It is a slow, methodical, and actually quite meditative process.
It sounds like a great way to spend a rainy afternoon if you're the kind of person who likes to solve puzzles and really understand the machine in front of you.
It really is. It turns your computer from a black box, a consumer appliance, into something you truly understand and have a personal relationship with. Even if you only get a 5% boost, there is a certain pride in knowing that your machine is unique. It is tuned specifically by you for your specific piece of silicon. You won the silicon lottery to some degree, and you are making the most of it.
I think that is what Daniel was getting at with his prompt. It is about that relationship between the human and the hardware. We don't have to just accept the numbers printed on the box as the final word. We can explore the boundaries ourselves.
Absolutely. And as long as there is a BIOS with a settings menu and a manual mode, there will be people like us trying to see what happens when we turn the dial just a little bit further than the engineers intended.
Well, I think we have covered the why, the how, and the risks of overclocking. It is a fascinating mix of manufacturing economics, high-level physics, and just plain old human curiosity.
It really is. It is one of those topics that seems like it is just about making numbers go up, but it actually touches on how our entire modern world is built at the atomic level.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say, if you have been enjoying these deep dives into the weird world of tech and the hidden mechanics of our gadgets, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. It genuinely helps the show reach more curious minds.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference for us. And if you have your own weird prompt, whether it is about computers, space, biology, or anything in between, head over to myweirdprompts.com and use the contact form, or just shoot us an email at show@myweirdprompts.com. We read every single one.
We really do. We are on all the major platforms, and our website has the full RSS feed if you want to subscribe that way and never miss an episode.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.